I'm going to say welcome to everyone. I'm Ceil Strauss. I'm the state floodplain manager, and today we're going to be talking about substantial damage determinations and the roles for local officials after floods. But today we're going to briefly talk about preparation. We're going to spend most of my time talking about those post-flood responsibilities and doing the actual substantial damage determinations. And then we'll spend a little bit of time at the end talking more high level about the federal declaration process and some of the terminology you might hear if there is a bigger flood. Off the top here, I'm mentioning that on our main website, we do have some links to information here on preparation, response, and recovery. If you go to that page, we've got a couple of videos that we recorded a few years ago here. They're both about 15, 16 minutes, so not super long. One's more focused on preparation before a flood and some of the things that you should be looking at as a local official. And then the other is more during the flood and recovery, which is a lot of the focus for today's presentation. In case you miss it, there's this spot here where you can expand, and we'll have links to all the different resources that we talk about in those videos. Some other trainings that we have that's available online. We do have the version of this that we did last year is still up there. We will replace that with this one in about another month. We do have one where we go into more detail about the post-discovery process and have some help from a FEMA person who knew more about that process and got into some nice details on that. And then if you want to know more about the grants that are available for flood damage reduction, we had a presentation with several FEMA, Homeland Security Emergency Management at the state level, and Matt Bauman, who works with our state flood hazard mitigation grant program. Something that got updated just a couple years, about a year and a half ago here, was the National Weather Service's page where you can see the details at the gauges. So if you aren't familiar with that page, you want to get familiar with that, especially if you're in one of the areas where they've got the more detailed gauge information. We did have an article about that in Water Talk. The most recent update has been that the National Weather Service now has what they're calling their flood inundation mapping tool. And this is showing the national map here. But to turn on that tool, we're going to go to this flood inundation part here. And here they've got some link to information at the top here about this relatively new service. And it's newer in southern Minnesota here. And to turn it on, you just scroll down a bit below where you're seeing those gauge links there. And you're going to enable the flood inundation portion. Zooming in here on Minnesota, these boundaries here, kind of reddish color. The southern part of the state now has that flood inundation mapping available. And we understand that the rest of the state will have it maybe in about a year. So not too far away. And while we're on this view, I wanted to point out the map options are up here because when you do zoom in, you're going to probably prefer to have the satellite view up, an aerial view. But if you do zoom in and look at things, this is kind of what you're going to see with that aerial satellite view. This is showing, in this example, it's a site in Vermont, but this is what will be available in Minnesota for those areas that are anticipated to have flooding in at least the next 5 days, is my understanding of how far out they're going with this. And we did have an article about that in Water Talk back last September that will also give some helpful information. But this is an example of a clip I took this morning at a site in Indiana. I went looking for one of the gauges that was higher, and that red I know is the more moderate flood risk there. So figured I'd see some interesting flooding being shown. And a couple things to point out here. When you turn it on, it's really opaque. So you probably want to be using that transparency bar there. Also, you can turn on the county boundaries in this administrative boundary option here. We do have a recording of a training that Sean Devaney with the National Weather Service gave on using this site back in October, and that's available on our training site. So this is a site I think is going to be really helpful in the future, and as we have higher water levels this season, we'll be checking it out, especially in that southern part of the state. Moving on to talk more specifically about your post-disaster responsibilities and substantial damage determinations. Oh, and I should point out this says recipes for disaster. During the flood, of course, the main thing that's going on is your first responders are out there. They're making rescues. Your transportation folks are going to be making sure that any roads that have water across them or potential damage, that they're closed. Folks will be gathering high water marks, and you'll want to be tracking staff time. So here's just a few shots from past floods where they're out there during flooded periods and rescuing people. We certainly have had plenty of floods in Minnesota in the past. We've done some great projects, so it's reducing the areas that we've had the major damage due to floods. But we do have flooding in Minnesota, and our goal is to keep the damage and the impacts of the flooding as small as possible, because floods are going to happen. So here's an example of a road that they would have had closed during the flood. You can see how the water came across, washed away a part of that road there. And during the actual floods, that's one of the community responsibilities, helping to get the word out that you've got barriers up there, that some of your roads are going to be closed. And we don't want people driving through those areas because you don't know what's below that water that's on the road. Here's another example where if you're just seeing the road, you're used to going across this bridge, you might think, oh, I can get across, but you don't know what's happened to that bridge. So a big part of our education and our communications during the floods is keeping people safe, keeping them away from places that have damage. And we do know that most common death situations are people who try crossing areas that have been washed out and people didn't realize it. Another thing that we encourage communities to do is get those watermarks. If it's getting out there while you can still see the stain lines, like in this example, or getting out there and either putting in stakes and marking them somehow, or nowadays we've got more of the GPS handhelds where people can go out and stand there and get those boundaries on the spot. But you'll be happy to have those boundaries, those watermarks later as you're trying to figure out how high did that water level get, and trying to map out where in your city, where in your community you most likely had the water and had damages. And here's one more example where we've got, in some communities, we have these nice official markers showing where that 100-year flood level is. And here's a flood where it got just a little bit above that, having that documentation. And this one was really more of a humorous version of one where they've got the statue and then they came later. Although I understand from the locals that actually Mary was floating, so that was a posed shot. But still trying to get at the importance of getting those water levels while the evidence is still there. The other thing at the local level you'll want to do is track your time for your staff, for your volunteers that are looking at those hours and efforts in responding to the flood. Because if there is a state or presidential declaration, you'll need that documentation of what additional time, what overtime was spent, what additional hours were put in there. And communities are really getting good about using their social media for all different things. And during the floods, we've seen communities do a great job of getting information on their websites, working with their local media, their radio stations or their newspapers, and especially using that social media, the Facebook, the various other social media sites that you're using there. And during the flood, it's those safety messages. It's don't go to this part of the city, don't go on these roads, they're closed. And immediately after, there's a lot of questions about what do we do with the debris? How do we get help? How do we sign up for inspections and possibly getting some help from the state or the federal government? But also in your role as the local administrators, reminding folks that they need to get permits to do the repairs and have inspections for those damage to the buildings and for a lot of other purposes. And speaking of doing inspections, see if this will work here. I'm trying to show the fish flopping on the couch, that when they're asked, when should we be getting out there and doing inspections? It's as soon as you're safe to get out there and look at things as the water's going down. And as one of my counterparts like to say is, while the fish are still flopping on the couch, you want to get out there right away and start looking at what the damage was and helping people to do the repairs and response that they need to do. So here's some pictures of various groups of inspectors. And there's a lot of different reasons that people are out there doing the inspections. Certainly looking at the health and safety, your building code kinds of folks are going to be out there looking at, is that building habitable? Or do we need to red card it and say that you can't go in this building, it's not habitable, it needs repairs, or it's not repairable, but whether or not you can go into that building. The assessor's offices are usually out there looking at the percentage of damage, because that will make a difference in what's being taxed in that calendar year or that fiscal year for that community. You as the local zoning officials need to get out and look at the buildings that are potentially substantially damaged. And we'll get into a little bit more detail on that. Our flood insurance adjusters are out there as soon as they can be, because as soon as the water level goes down, if folks have flood insurance and they were damaged, they're going to be contacting their insurance agents, making their claims and hoping to get their funding, the claim funds as soon as possible so that they can get back into that building and be able to continue life there. We'll get into a little bit more detail later, but initial damage inspections to determine if there's going to be a state or federal declaration. Preliminary damage assessments is what those are called. And the Minnesota Department of Homeland Security Emergency Management and our Department of Public Safety, they're our lead agency. They're the main ones involved in doing those preliminary damage assessments in Minnesota. Your county emergency managers should be familiar with that process, and they're usually going to be your main contact at the local level, at the county level, and then some communities would also be big enough that they have separate emergency managers named. But certainly in the more rural county areas, your county emergency manager is going to be a key contact at the local level. And others might be helping with those depending on the size of the flood and or the kind of disaster. So in really big ones, you might have some FEMA staff coming in, Department of Health, DNR, and more, not so commonly, but occasionally helping there. And then public assistance versus individual assistance declarations. Those are two different kinds of declarations. Public assistance is about those public facilities, public buildings, and those kinds of things, whereas individual assistance is about damage to homes and businesses. And sometimes you'll get volunteer organizations like American Red Cross out there helping, doing some of the initial inspections and viewing of where the damage is. Here's a little info sheet that FEMA had put out a few years ago, kind of talking about the different kinds of inspections you might have. Sometimes communities think this is helpful for their citizens if they're seeing a lot of different people out there and want to know if they're legit and why they would be coming for inspections. But moving on and talking more about your role as local officials, we have our post-flood substantial damage playbook. We issued this a few years ago, and if any of you have been through floods and if you have any comments on what we've got in here, things that you wish we had that we didn't, or things that need updating or confusing, please reach out, let us know. We want it to be a useful document. But before I get into some of the details there, I wanted to talk about what is substantial damage. And that is a federal definitions, federal requirements that you're looking at whether a building is substantially damaged or not. It's usually going to be impacting those older non-conforming buildings, because anything built since you had your FEMA maps and your ordinance should have been built in compliance. But those older buildings, they were built before we knew where the floodwaters were in many cases and had the rules that we've got in place. But if there is a big flood or tornado or fire, the damage can be due to any source. And that's one of the things that is noted in that definition, damage from any origin. And then they're looking at what's the cost to restore that building to the pre-damage condition. And you're comparing what's the cost to do those repairs to the market value of just the building, not including the land. And important phrase here that it's regardless of the actual repair work performed, because sometimes after a flood or damage, someone might say, well, I want to keep my repairs under that 50% trigger, so I'm only going to repair a part of my building so that I'm spending less than that 50%. That is not the way it works. That you as a local government, you're looking at what is the full cost to bring it back into that pre-damage condition. And you can't just say, I'm going to only do a part of that. Now, when you're doing that initial screening, you're going to look at where are the buildings with the potential damage that might be substantially damaged. And you're going to have to narrow things down a bit. First, you're going to look at what's within your responsibility. Where's your community boundary and what buildings are within your community? And then what buildings were in that impacted area? Which ones had the flooding or the tornado impacts that you need to look at? So you narrow that down. And then in this example, we're showing the special flood hazard area, that 1% annual chance flood is just this area. So out of all these buildings, we've narrowed it down to 4 in the community, 2 in the impacted area, and just 1 that's actually in the floodplain area where you must do those substantial damage determinations and require permits if there has been damage. And we do have this little flow chart because some people like flow charts versus checklists. And it does kind of step you through. Was it in the floodplain, in that 100-year floodplain where your regulations apply? Was it substantially damaged? If it's close or a yes, then you're going to go over here and do that substantial damage determination. If not, then the community can issue a repair permit for whatever repairs need to be done, and that person can get right back in there and do those repairs. And FEMA does emphasize you need to be giving repair permits when you're having a big flood. And part of that is because folks have a tendency to, while they're in there doing their repairs, they may go beyond what was the flood damage or that tornado damage or whatever event you just had, and do other improvements that they've been meaning to do while the contractors that they're doing the work. So you're being clear about what it is that they're repairing so that they're not doing substantial improvements and making that, hitting that 50% trigger with the improvements and the damage together. So you're going to review those damaged buildings. And again, even if it's not flooding, maybe you had a big tornado that affected a part of your community, you're going to be looking in the floodplain area if any of that tornado damage was in that floodplain area. And you're going to look at, is it clear that they're substantially damaged? If so, you're going to issue them that determination. If it's something that's clearly not substantially damaged, maybe they got some repairs to do, they had a little bit of damage, but it's clear that they're not substantially damaged, you can give them that repair permit, let them go on. Those that are in that 35 to 65% range, you're going to probably want to get more details, do a more detailed inspection. What parts of the community, a lot of times you can, even if you didn't see where the water went, you didn't have good watermarks, you're going to have a pretty good idea just based on where the debris is that's in the community. Those are the neighborhoods that they had the damage, and you're going to need to be looking. Some of your initial inspections and screenings, they can be more or less sophisticated. This is an example where it's a small town. They just literally went out there with the FEMA map at that time and marked which buildings they looked at, which ones were potentially damaged more and they needed to look at in more detail. But these days, most communities and certainly all the counties have better GIS systems and are keeping nice electronic records that can be shared in different ways and showing where those damaged buildings are. Some of the determinations will be easier than others. Here's an example of a building that was clearly substantially damaged. And if you're seeing like manufactured homes that have any amount of water on them, they're usually considered substantially damaged based on what we've heard from people who've been involved in many different kinds of floods in the past. Here's one of the FEMA documents that's more of a summary of some of the most common questions you get about substantial improvement and substantial damage. On the flip side, you can see this is a little storage building of some kind, maybe a garage. The materials, it looks like it's some kind of metal. You can see the stain here, so you'll document where the water got to, that it had some flooding, but this is the kind of thing that it's probably got that concrete slab, and that's something you can just kind of hose down, and hopefully any materials that were in there were elevated or removed before the flood came, and they didn't have much to clean out. In basements, which is where a lot of our flooding still occurs in Minnesota, we like our basements, and we've got a lot of them, especially in the buildings that were built before we had the floodplain maps. Usually it's not going to be a substantial damage in a basement. Most commonly, you're going to have damage to the furnace, the water heater. You might have some more damage to your other utilities, but usually it's more the cleanup that you're looking at in basements. There can be cases where you've got foundation damage. There you're more likely to see substantial damage. But you're getting in there, you're documenting that, you're taking pictures, you're making sure that you've got those pictures associated with the correct address and PID and documenting what happened there. And sometimes just looking at buildings from the front are not enough. Here's an example where from the front, this doesn't look too bad. You've got a little bit of water on the building. I can certainly see the mud line on those bushes. But if you come around to the back, you can see more clearly that they had some real damage to the foundation. And that's the rest of the story, as the slide says. A lot of great examples of pictures that Winona County took back in, I think this was the 2007 or 8 flood here. And they did a really nice job taking a lot of pictures, getting a lot of documentation of what happened in those homes. In our playbook, we do have some tables like this that, based on experience over time, information's been gathered on what depth of flooding for what kinds of buildings are you most likely to see damage. So for a 1-story on a slab, if you get up to 1.5, even 2 feet, you're getting to the point where you're more likely to have substantial damage. Whereas if you've got 2 stories, you go up a little bit higher, which makes sense. If it's a mobile home, it pretty much, if they get any water, if they've got half a foot even of water up on that main level, it pretty much wicks up and damages that whole building. And that's something we see and hear consistently. So here, zoomed in a little bit more. So communities might use this and say, okay, there's only basement flooding. We're not going to worry about it. But here we look at water getting onto that main part of the building. We're going to look more closely. When we do have potentially substantial damage, you're going to need to look at more detailed review and break out all the different components. How much damage was to the to the walls and the roof and the interior and in all these different categories. Again, we've talked about how it does apply for flooding and for other kinds of damage, but I want to compare substantial damage to substantial improvement. And from the federal definitions, the 44 Code of Federal Regulations here in the definitions, they talk about what substantial improvements are. And that includes reconstruction, rehabilitation, addition, or other improvement of the structure. And that, again, is the 50% trigger of the structure's market value before the start of construction. And when you're doing that, you're also looking at any repairs and improvements that have been made within the previous year, and you're looking at the damage that you're fixing at the same time. It does have some wording that says you don't have to include the cost of fixing things that were identified in advance by a government official. They actually had red tagged maybe the furnace or the electric or something like that. Or if it's a historic structure, we've got some different rules. There's a little bit more, actually a lot more flexibility on what you can do to repair a historic structure if it's officially designated a historic structure. And FEMA's desk reference here, this is about a 1/2-inch thick reference document, and there is the link here. This is a really helpful document that gets into a lot of nice detail. And it's got some flow charts to get you to the right part of the document so you can look at, is the damage possibly more or less than 50%, whether it's is substantially damaged or substantial improvement, or it's not. And it breaks things out nicely. While we're talking about how do you figure out that market value? And in most counties in Minnesota, you're going to use the most consistent way to do that is to work with your county assessor, see what the assessed value is for the buildings. And in our county records, the assessors do show the assessed value separate for the buildings versus the land, which is good because we only want to be looking at the market value of that building itself. And in some cases, they may need a multiplier. Haven't seen that so much in Minnesota, but definitely in other states, the assessed value might only be like 80% of the market value. And that's something that is usually known at the county level, what kind of multiplier you need. And then if folks don't like the assessed value that you're using, they do have the opportunity to appeal it. And in most cases, communities are going to accept an official appraisal as the appeal. And if that official appraisal does show that the building is more, has a higher market value, then you can use that for determining whether it's substantially damaged or not. And you'll also make sure that your assessor's office has that for tax purposes going forward. DNR does have a sample permit form that we've got a simplified one for non-buildings, and then this is on the building version. And for those non-conforming structures where we're looking at whether it might be substantially damaged or not, we kind of step you through some of these steps that you would look at to determine if it's substantially damaged or not. And in our playbook, we do follow fairly closely with what we've got in our sample permit form. In that FEMA desk reference that we were showing, one of the other things that they've got is a nice listing of what must be included in the costs. And a couple key things here is someone might say, well, I'm just going to do all the work myself, or I'm getting volunteer labor. I got a bunch of buddies. I'm going to, pay them with a case of beer and we're going to do the work. Or I've got all this material being donated to me, so my cost is basically nothing. But what the guidelines say, what the rules say is that you've got to look at what the cost would be if it was a contractor doing the work, not volunteer labor. You've got to look at what that equivalent value is. The other thing that it points out here in the FEMA specifics is you would include typical overhead and profit for a contractor in that part of the state. And it also has a nice list of some of the things you don't have to include here. So that can be real helpful to make things clear. And in our playbook, we do have a sample letter that if you do the determination and it is substantially damaged, in our example here, we're showing the calculation is that it's 60% damaged, then we've got a sample letter that you can put on your community letterhead here and send to that household and notify them officially that they are substantially damaged, that they're going to need to work with you on bringing that building into compliance with your current ordinance. And if they do have a flood insurance policy, making them aware that they then would be eligible for what's called the increased cost of compliance rider on their flood insurance policy. And that increased cost of compliance, it allows up to $30,000 to go toward the costs of bringing that building into compliance, whether that's bringing in a house mover and elevating the building and putting in a new foundation, moving it to a higher place on the site. Maybe they're filling in the basement and adding on some other areas to make up that lost space that they've got there in the basement, those kinds of things. And the things that are eligible, you use FRED to remember that floodproofing, if it's a non-residential building, relocating, the cost to elevate, the cost to demolish. And again, the ICC will pay that amount up to $30,000 for those costs. And from what we hear around the country, that's actually on the low side for many places, that the costs are more than that. But in order to be eligible, they have to get that floodplain administrator to make that official determination so that that person can hand that to the insurance adjuster that's looking at their claim. So here's an example, a building. This is an example in Illinois, in a county where they have a lot of flooding on the Mississippi River, and they did a lot of increased cost compliance projects. So that building was flooded. They got their increased cost of compliance, got the money to elevate that building. They use the alternative elevation method here, where they're using the flood resistant materials, putting in their automatic opening vents. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you have the wording in your ordinance, there's two ways that the increased cost of compliance can be triggered. It's always going to be triggered if there's substantial damage. But if you have the language in your ordinance that says if you've got flood-related damage 2 times within 10 years within an average damage of 25% or more, so the two claims together are over 50%, that also will qualify for getting that increased cost of compliance funding there. We've had it in our model ordinance for over 10 years now, and most communities do adopt that, which can help your citizens if you do have a couple of floods within that 10-year period. Then again, they would be also eligible to get that ICC funding, even if it's not substantial damage from one event. And again, the options are to floodproof if it's non-residential, relocate to higher ground, elevate in place, or the cost for demolition. Also, even if they aren't substantially damaged, you're not requiring them to bring it into compliance. There's certainly some things we would encourage communities to get information out there and encourage folks that, hey, if your furnace got damaged due to this flood, we encourage you to elevate it and put it up on that next floor. If you got flooded in your basement this time, you're probably going to have flooding again and have some of those things get damaged again. So relocating any of those utilities, ductwork, the things that got damaged, propane tanks, having them nicely anchored. We have pictures from various floods of propane tanks floating around, crashing into buildings or obstructing bridges and those kinds of things. I want to mention that this is not a minimum requirement. We have had communities in the past tell people that they had to replace their furnace on the upper level, but then got challenged and it wasn't actually in their ordinance. This is a nice higher standard that we would encourage you to consider, that if utilities like this are damaged, that they're required to be elevated, even if it's not the whole building being substantially damaged. Shifting gear here a little bit, getting back to talking about the declaration process, the state and federal declaration process. I mentioned earlier that soon after the floodings occurred, they'll be getting in there and doing preliminary damage assessments if they think that it's a big enough flood or other type of disaster that they might be hitting the triggers to qualify for consideration of a state or federal declaration. Usually they won't go in the buildings. They'll be doing more of a quick eye check of where the damage is. And the public assistance, they'll be looking at funding for that to help pay for the emergency response efforts, and then longer term repairs for that public infrastructure and public buildings. Individual assistance, again, is for homes and businesses. This is a little bit dated here, but gives you a feel for what the thresholds are. For Minnesota, as of 24, we had to have over 10 million in public assistance damage statewide, and then each county had to meet a declaration that was, or amount that was based on the population of that county. So, and I do know that Homeland Security Emergency Management has that updated for the county triggers for 25, but for your county to be declared that you need that statewide over the probably close to 11 million now. And then each county has to be meeting that minimum trigger. And then if that trigger's met, the governor can make a request to the president that we have a formal declaration for flooding there. And FEMA determines whether that presidential declaration is going to be made. And in the past year, not all of those floods that met state level triggers were getting the declaration at the federal level. And as we're looking at changes potentially with Department of Homeland Security and with FEMA, that is one of the areas that Congress and the work group that was looking at recommendations for FEMA and for law updates, they're looking at possibly changing what the triggers would be and have shifting more of the responsibility to the state level. So we'll be watching to see what happens over the next couple years here. But while I'm on this page, I'll mention that there are a couple of nice FEMA resources on the FEMA site. They've got a page on how a disaster gets declared. There are some video resources on there. And then Homeland Security Emergency Management at the state level, they've got their disaster recovery page, and they have a lot of resources on that page. They used to have this nice 2-pager document. I'm not finding it on their site anymore, and we'll see if they get an update for that. But it was kind of a nice summary notice that they used to have there. But then what does get measured in terms of determining if you're going to have a declaration? You're going to be looking at all these things that are considered public infrastructure and public response responsibilities. And normally, when there is a federal disaster declaration, the feds cover 75% and the state is required, or the locals are required to cover that 25% cost share. Since 2014 at the state level in Minnesota, we have a fund that money's been going into to help locals pay for that cost share when there is a federal declaration. And we also have a separate state declaration. If the federal declaration's not hit, but we hit 50% of that federal trigger, then it's a state declaration is made, and the state covers reimbursing communities for many of these damages that you see at the local level. So looking at a few of the more recent years, we did have a federal declaration in 23 impacting all these different counties here around the state, and shows the incident period. Oh, here's where we have a video link. You can also see links to what past disasters have happened. You can go to Minnesota and select your county if you want to see your county specific information. But then looking at public assistance is declared, and they'll say what categories of public assistance are declared. And these categories The emergency work is categories A and B. So it's debris removal and emergency response costs, the cost of getting people out there, rescuing people, getting out the barriers so people don't drive places that are at risk, and those kinds of things. And that kind of assistance is available to all communities. But then the permanent work is in these other categories, categories C through G. Common things that we see are damage to roads and bridges. Sometimes we'll see damage to our public buildings. More often, we're going to see public utilities and parks and some of those kinds of things getting damaged. But this permanent work, you can only get the assistance if your community is in the National Flood Insurance Program. All of our counties, the unincorporated parts of our counties are in the program, but we do have quite a few cities around the state that are not in the program. So they can still get the emergency declarations, the debris removal, emergency response kind of help, but they won't get help with those permanent facilities. And here's a listing of the kinds of things that are in each of these categories in a little bit more detail, if you want more detail. Now in 24, we had a big flood, and we actually had quite a few of the individual assistance declarations, which is not something that's very common in Minnesota. So we look at all these counties where we had both public assistance and individual assistance. So we did have the assistance for homes and businesses, and they set up separate places for people to go and to apply for that assistance. But again, point out that's not common in Minnesota. It is more common for us to have the public assistance because those roads and bridges and those kinds of things are more likely to get damaged during our floods. But if we do have individual assistance, FEMA will deploy lots of folks usually to help. And our state Homeland Security Emergency Management folks are definitely out there in force, and local emergency managers and those that they can get help at the local level out there seeing who needs help, who doesn't have a place to sleep and that they can live. And they'll set up disaster recovery centers. And in 24, we did see how FEMA would set those up. They tried to set them up in the communities where the most damage was so that people didn't have to travel very far. They do give warnings to folks, warning them about scammers and that the FEMA folks will be properly identified and they won't ask for credit card numbers or those kinds of things unless someone goes to those disaster recovery centers and you're going through the process there. But the other thing we want to point out is even if there is the individual assistance declared, most of the aid is not grants, it's not handouts. Most of the aid is going to be a small business administration loan that has to be paid back. When they do give out the grants, they first look at, does this person have insurances covering their loss? Were they eligible to get an SBA loan? If they're not eligible for those things and they have great needs, that's when they're looking at grants through the individual assistance grants. The maximum amount you can get for that grant is not a ton of money, and that's someone who's really been damaged and has no resources available to them. But most of the time, it's more like in the 5,000 range, and the actual assistance in the 24 flood, there were almost 4,000 families that got grants, and the average was about 3,500. So not a lot of money. Bottom line, people shouldn't be depending on assistance from FEMA, even if there is individual assistance declared. And again, most floods, we don't have any assistance for the individuals and businesses if they're damaged. Whereas in this example, in 24, the average flood insurance policy was over $35,000 to help people get back on their feet. And here's another way to look at it. This was a FEMA slide from a few years ago where they were showing the amount of the average flood insurance claim is the darker bar here, and then the average individual assistance grant. And we've had a couple of past big floods, and those were, again, quite a few years ago. most recent floods, we don't see any individual assistance on, and I circled the Minnesota examples here. So getting back to talking about the public assistance, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly at a high level, but they've got a very involved process that you go through to get that public assistance. And the first phase is identifying those projects, the applicant briefings. So they'll be out there usually at the county level, but again, trying to look at where they think the most damage is. They more recently, or more of them are virtual, but in the past they had been in person. They're usually led by staff from Homeland Security Emergency Management. They'll typically work with that county emergency manager in getting them set up. And they will have pretty quick turnarounds for you to get that information in there, get the preliminary damage assessments done, and look at what kind of projects need to be done and where the repairs are going to be needed. And they do have these recovery scoping meetings where you'll have a FEMA case manager, and the public assistance staff will look in more detail at what is needed, what the costs are, and those kinds of things. And here in phase 2, they're getting more details. They're figuring out where the projects are. They're doing inspections, and again, working with communities to figure out what kind of improvements or repairs are going to be needed, and all kinds of different steps here, and then writing up more exactly what's going on, getting the joint field office staff involved in making sure that the application is in compliance and eligible here. And finally, getting the final project reviews, doing the work, where there's a final reviews of the environmental historical preservation requirements, getting the funding obligated, and doing that work. And then once the work's done, documenting that it met what was being required and getting it closed out. So in this slide, when we were presenting this with the FEMA staff, they pointed out these are some of the key points that communities would be involved in, is that applicant briefing, which again happens fairly quickly after the flood. These recovery scoping meetings are usually a few months out, and sometimes you've got some turnover in the FEMA staff that are involved, and then when the actual work is being done, that it's been completed and can be signed off on, and you can get your refunds of what was spent there. So they do have this public assistance program policy guide, got updated just a little over a year ago. But one of the things to look at, and that we really encourage, is they've got this section 406, which is a program to look at, do we really want to build back the way it was, or some things that we can be doing to make this more resilient into the future? So sometimes that's some hard armoring along the side slopes of roads that get damaged a lot. But the one we like to point out here as an example is what they're calling relief culverts. So a culvert is undersized, gets washed out, and they realize that the issue is that the culvert was undersized. And we would encourage you to look at working with those public assistance folks and trying to find better ways to repair things. But you'll be working again with the Homeland Security Emergency Management folks on those repairs. Don't forget to get permits. If there's a DNR permit involved, it's below the ordinary hive of public water. We do have our general permit for repair after flood damages. And if there's a federal state declaration, it's automatically in effect, but our DNR managers can say, hey, in this county, in that county, we had enough damage. We're saying that the general permit is in effect. And it basically lays out all those things that could be damaged during a flood that you can repair without an individual permit. And it's definitely a streamlined, faster process. But you don't always want to put back what was there. And we do encourage looking at what we call our floodplain culverts and our geomorphic approach, We do have a training about that, and this is a link to the site on our website that talks about those options. We do have some cost share grants to help pay for that additional cost of putting in those culverts. The last few minutes here, we'll talk about, remember, there's grants out there. There's federal grants, there's state grants. For some of those grants, you have to have your county all hazard plan up to date. And in there, you're saying what your priorities are for projects. And that project in general has to be included in that plan. Might be buying out or elevating properties that were at most risk. Might be, in this example here in Granite Falls, they actually bought out the city hall and some main buildings along the river and left a nice open spot here to make it easier to protect the buildings that were left in future floods. In Moorhead, they did a lot of neighborhood level work here where they had all these buildings on the riverside, and now they have removed most of them. There's one holdout still, and then put in neighborhood levees to protect the remaining buildings. East Grand Forks, greatly flooded, and especially in '97. Here's what it looked like before. They had this barrier here. They brought that levee way back, made more of this into open space, and put in a nice flood wall and dikes around the city, protecting the city there from. They've had big floods since '97 and had very little damage. I mentioned at the beginning that we've got our preparation, response, recovery page. And there, I think we didn't have too many questions. I'm not seeing any questions in our chat here, but I want to say thanks to everyone for attending today. I hope that it was helpful information. We appreciate folks coming